So, good evening everyone. My name is Max Delmar, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the 2009 Cotterrell Lecture in Sociological Jurisprudence. As many of you I think will know, this is a series now in its 5th year that is named in honour of our much loved and much esteemed colleague Roger Cotterrell, whose contributions to sociological jurisprudence I think will be known to many of you. And it's a great pleasure to see Roger and his wife Anne here with us again this evening, so thank you. There's actually a personal connection which I just heard about from our speaker, chatting away before. 2 sets of personal connections, in fact. One is that the first is that Roger was the external examiner of Scott's PhD thesis. So that's one connection. The other personal connection is the other way, and that is that Professor Veitch had the misfortune of having to examine a PhD, a benevolently ambitious PhD student sometime in Edinburgh a few moons ago. So a symmetry, if you like, there. Having survived that ordeal, actually, I wonder, or I'll take it as having survived that ordeal as giving me some right, not the obligation, to embarrass Scott a little bit in public. And he's very easy to embarrass, given the extent of his achievements and the quality of his scholarship. In fact, we've been advertising him recently as one of the world's leading critical legal thinkers, and even discounting for the usual hyperbole that goes along with such advertisements, I think that's more than an accurate statement. Scott has come to us all the way from Hong Kong, where he holds the Paul K.C. Chung Chair of Jurisprudence. But I first got to know him, as I mentioned, when he was still in Scotland, and where he also held a chair in jurisprudence at the University of Glasgow. My first encounter with Scott's work was with his first book, Moral Conflict and Legal Reasoning, which was published in 1999, and which raised a series of powerful objections against what Scott called liberal legal structures, and in particular as to whether they were able to make sufficiently meaningful room for moral conflict or moral dissensus. Aside from the substance of the argument, which was recognized by many as an important contribution, the book won the 1998 European Award for Legal Theory. One thing I was struck back then about his work, and which I continue to be struck by in reading his work over the years, is just by the sheer power of his writing. I think Scott, for me, is one of the best writers of contemporary legal theory. If you want an example of writing that can combine passion, voice, a great sense of voice, with the best virtues of analysis, clarity, then I recommend that you look at Scott's work. And for me, it's always been an experience to read Scott's work, and an experience that is often a very emotional one. So one of the emotions that I often find myself experiencing when reading him is something like moral outrage, a mix of incredulity and indignation. And you might ask, at what? Well, at, for instance, the capacity of law to help us evade and disavow responsibilities, or the capacity of law to make invisible certain harms of suffering while also creating them. And that was present already in that first book on moral conflict and legal reasoning in 1999, but it was perhaps, for me at least, came through most strongly in his second short and powerful book, Law and Irresponsibility on the Legitimation of Human Suffering, which was published in 2007. And in his most recent work, Scott has turned his critical eye on a relation that I think has always interested him, that between law and political economy, and at the capacity of law to create and exploit inequalities. And I think it's that project that we'll be hearing about more tonight. I want to just add one more final point. and that's that as strong as Scott's critical voice is, and as much as one may experience more outrage when reading his work, I don't come away from his work with a feeling of despair. Scott may be doing a lot of fighting against the reduction of meaningful dissensus, fighting against the disavowal of responsibility, fighting against the creation and exploitation of inequality. But I think he's also doing a lot of fighting for plurality, for responsibility, for disagreement, for community, for equality. And tonight, his title for his lecture is The Ecology of Obligations. And now it gives me great pleasure to invite him to deliver the 2019 Cotterrell lecture.
Thank you very much, Max. Duly embarrassed. That was a wonderful introduction. It's a great honor for me to be here to give this lecture and to have Roger here and for my first time to be at Queen Mary. What Roger probably doesn't remember about my PhD viva, and probably the only bit that I do, because I was in the usual blur of nerves in going through it, was that Zenon Bankowski, who might be known to many of you here, was the internal examiner, and the viva finished by Zenon asking a question which started, how does this apply to the story of Abraham? As only Zenon would. And of course I had no idea, so the only thing that came into my head was the line from Bob Dylan, God said to Abraham, kill me a son. At which point Zenon reached up for a bottle of vodka and said, right, that's the viva finished. So it was a very happy occasion for me to have met Roger for the first time then. His work has always been a source of great insight and inspiration in my own work. The topic tonight for me is the ecology of obligations. And in the abstract that was distributed, I put a quote from H.L.A. Hart. And this is what I want to start on, but I'm not going to say too much more about either Hart or that particular style. But the line itself that I took, I thought was a promising one to enter into the subject of my presentation tonight. So, why would, quote, the figure of a bond binding the person obligated haunt much of legal thought? That's what Hart claims. What is that figure, or metaphor, as Hart called it? And why would it haunt? After all, the figure of a rights holder with its entitlements doesn't haunt legal thought. Why the figure of a bond binding the person obligated then? Well, consider a couple of possible reasons. The first is what I might call squeamishness or squeamish legal thinking, either actually or theoretically. Legal philosophy generally, and analytical philosophy in particular, is particularly squeamish when it comes to looking at bodies and their binding. Of course, not every legal analysis or account of obligation has been so squeamish or so haunted by this bound figure. Famously, in the account that Nietzsche gave of the origins of obligation, it's precisely, according to him, the bound body and the infliction of cruelty on it that lies at the root, not just of obligation, but of normativity itself. So in the genealogy of morals, he asks how to breed an animal that is entitled to make promises. He traces back to Roman law and what he calls a very material concept of debt, when a debtor could literally be bound, physically bound, until he performed what he owed. Rather than say more about Nietzsche, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, there's another lesser well-known but near contemporary of Nietzsche, William Galbraith Miller, who was a lecturer in jurisprudence at the University of Glasgow in the late 19th century. And he similarly argued at great length that the roots of obligation grew in the very material practices of binding people. in his remarkable and largely forgotten work, The Data of Jurisprudence, he argued that, as he put it, slavery is the starting point of obligation. In this institution, we find the physical meeting point of the ideas of property, obligation, and political subjection. For Miller, obligation took form on the bodies of slaves. And this physical meeting point, as he put it, of the material and the conceptual, was something that he found throughout legal history and the development of legal doctrine more generally. We shall find, he argued in his methodology, a physical foundation, a gradual idealizing, and in many cases, a new physical application. So for Miller, even if the binding of slaves no longer provided the physical application for obligation, the interplay between the material and the ideal was far more complex than that suggested by portraying the bond, as Hart did, as merely a figure or a metaphor. So one alternative account then of this haunting lies in an alternative trajectory that focuses on the body and the roots of normativity and obligation in the body. On another view, another possible account, this haunting registers not so much the individual figure of a bound person as the very spectre of modernity's prehistory. It appears as a remnant of a whole set of mentalities and worldviews. For most of human history, there were no such things as rights. These are a Western invention that came to dominance only with the emergence and consolidation of capitalism. But the same can't be said of obligations. Their pervasiveness and resilience have been well charted. Ties of kinship, reciprocity, redistribution, gift giving, gift receiving, and the like all involve forms of obligation that were wide-ranging and durable. It was obligations that formed the weave of communities and complex relationships, often over large distances of time and space. Likewise, ancient religions such as Judaism were centrally concerned with obligations and practices of obedience, a connection I'm going to come back to. And one looks in vain for a Christian precept in the Bible that begins, "It is your right to," whatever. Roman law even itself had no recognizably modern account of rights. It was rather forms of action that were correlative to the operization of obligations. And even as Christianity developed in the early modern period, obligations still held primacy. The overwhelming emphasis was on duty in modern natural law, according to Hackinson. Notions of virtue, he says, were to be interpreted in terms of duty. Rights derived from duty. Prima facie supererogatory acts were to be simply seen as special duties. There's no better figure for this than another lecturer, this time in philosophy, at Glasgow University, Viscount Stair, in the late 17th century, who for him, freedom, as it was emerging in the form of rights, were situated between two forms of obligation. What he called obediential obligation, the obligations written on men's hearts by God, and on the other side, those of engagement, where people make contracts or arrangements in exercising and then binding their freedom. Also in ethical thinking, there's an enduring strand of the priority of obligations. In the 20th century, perhaps no more formidable account of this is than that given by Simone Weil and her treatment of obligations as correlative to needs primarily and only secondarily and subsidiarily as rights. Finally, by way of example of this alternative history, the whole of Chinese moral thought and civilization had, particularly in its dominant Confucian conceptions, no account of rights whatsoever. Rather, there were strict rules setting out the obligations to be found at various levels in a social hierarchy and organisation, and a form of extensive and incredibly enduring geographical ordering over centuries that had no conception of rights at all. So, the idea that rights and obligations are correlative is therefore a highly contingent one and a modern one. All these forms of human organisation that I've just described had an abundance of obligations but no rights. The figure of a bond then doesn't haunt these forms, but is rather instead central to social ordering, an achievement in which a complex weave, to quote Karl Polanyi, of custom and law, magic and religion cooperated in inducing individuals to comply with rules of behaviour. What would haunt these formations might be the unbound person, the person with what modern psychologists might call attachment issues. Them and the beasts or subhumans, those who couldn't understand the law, those, to come back to my viva, condemned to drift or else be kept from drifting. In this perspective, the modern fixation with rights may be haunted by the figure of a bond, but in so being, it would be exceptional historically. Samuel Moyn recently in an article said, "Our age of rights, lacking a public language of duties, is a historical outlier." But this is, I suggest, not the whole story. It's of course true that rights talk does have a presence now, that obligations talk, if we have such a thing, doesn't. After all, we frequently refer to the importance of human rights, but we speak less readily and certainly less ably about human obligations. We bear witness to human rights violations daily in the media, though we talk much less about violations of human obligations. And it's significant that we have courts of human rights, not courts of human obligations. So even if today legal rights and obligations are thought of as correlative, then our language and institutions display a prioritization of rights that sits oddly with the idea of that correlation. To describe our contemporary legal and political culture as equally an age of obligations would sound not only strange, but very much contrary to the spirit of the times. So if obligations once formed the groundwork, the primary category of legal, moral, religious and political thought, then today, at least with respect to law and politics, their appearance is mainly to have been drawn into the service of rights. And yet, as I say, I don't think this is the whole story. It's here that the understanding of sociological jurisprudence, as Roger has been so eloquent in developing, might be brought to bear as a different way of perceiving the dominant self-image of our time. For on the one hand, the emerging predominance of rights has in fact relied on the persistence, prevalence, and indeed the multiplication of obligations and especially practices of obedience. These arguably make possible the simultaneous underpinning and betrayal of the promises that rights offer. On the other hand, this situation has been consistently neglected or underplayed in contemporary legal thought, whether in its more mainstream guises or indeed even in its more critical instantiations. Taken together then, whilst there's a saturation of obligations and practices of obedience that both persists in modern societies, it's not adequately captured in the common designations and theorizations of these as exemplifying ours as an age of rights. Well, in order to address this neglect, to understand the situation better, and to an extent rebalance the dominant picture, I would want to say something tonight about what I've titled this lecture, the ecology of obligations. I take the term ecology here to evoke the diverse but interconnected network of bonds from which there is no escape. In terms of natural ecology, it marks out the conditions of relationality and reflexivity that constitute what a writer on natural ecology calls the extraordinarily complex and subtle web of organic and non-organic life, which is relational in the sense that entities related are constituted by those relationships, and reflexive in that action and manipulation in one place inevitably affects other aspects of it in other places. So to explore this idea of the ecology of obligations then, it seems to me that we need to understand ecology in a double sense. The first sense, it concerns the main conditions within which obligations circulate. Obligations do their work in reliance on conditions that make social communication and action in modern society what they are. These enable or allow obligations to do their work. Among these conditions are very elementary, if complex, features of modern society that include, amongst others, the following: natural and technical languages, the division of labour with its dependencies and interdependencies, its cooperative and productive capacities, material and virtual technologies, all the way from engines through to computers to the internet, economic infrastructures such as currency, finance, circulation, exchange, markets, and so on. And finally, for now, the more or less formally organized groupings in civil society, in workplaces, in institutions, bureaucracies, and so on. A list like this is necessarily extensive and likely always incomplete. But these conditions are those within which obligations can operate by drawing on resources that can be found there. Resources such as expectations, dependencies, and coercion. They do so within collectivities, forms of cooperation, and structures of solidarity that enable both obligations and practices of obedience and forms of trust and reliance. So obligations depend on all these formations to do their work. That's the first sense of the ecology of obligations. The second sense then of this phrase, the ecology of obligations, concerns the conditions or techniques that obligations themselves provide for practices or modes of organization, communication, or regulation. Obligations establish one form of glue that holds together commitments through constraints. These are central to social practices as varied as friendships and other intimate relationships, as well as highly institutionalized roles, obligations of office, for example, of trustee or guardian or judge or civil servant. The ecology provided by obligations relies on their capacity to bind. They provide modes of communication and action that are non-optional, necessary, not in a causal sense, but normatively. So they can bind people to institutions or expectations in a way that entitlements or rights do not, since obligation's primary mode of existence is connective and constraining. There'll be more to these formations than just obligations, of course, but obligations nevertheless are crucial components of them. Now, it'd be clear already from the description of these two forms, the conditions within which obligations operate and the conditions that obligations make possible, that these two senses of the ecology of obligation are interconnected. Obligations rely for their work on social conditions and structures that rely in turn on obligations. But this is exactly why the relationality and reflexivity appropriate to natural ecology seems apt to describe how obligations do their work. Now, to try and make all this slightly more concrete, let me briefly turn to legal obligations and show how certain specificities of such obligations function under this description. Specificities of legal obligation. The first distinguishing feature is that legal obligations operate between legal persons. As such, the categories of actors to which they attach is far greater than just human beings. Legal obligations attach to fictional entities, to corporations, to institutions, even to as yet non-existent or still non-existent persons, and so on. Such institutionalized inventiveness means that the reach of obligations in law is far wider than is conceivable in, for example, conventional moral thinking. Moreover, the reciprocity between legal personality and obligation highlights that identity and constraint are mutually related. This is essentially because role obligations, obligations of role, are the archetypal form of obligations in law. Simple examples of these would be roles of obligation of company directors, of public officials, of employers and employees, but also what may be thought to be more private relations too, such as those between parent and child, husband and wife. In all these, the constitutive link between obligation and legal personality structure not only legal institutions, expectations and relations, but also thereby play a crucial and distinctive role in structuring social relations and expectations more generally in society. So that's the first one, the significance of legal personality in organizing legal obligations. The second characteristic of legal obligations that is central to their contemporary operation is one whose inventiveness can also be traced back to Roman law. That is, obligations can be treated as things, not just as ties between legal persons. As incorporeal things, as the Romans had it, obligations, importantly, are or can be commodified, centrally as money and debt. This is one of the most important instantiations of obligations in law in capitalist societies, and it relies on a second-order transformation of primary obligations into tradable assets or rights. The economic and social function of these can't be overstated, in particular since they deploy modes of constraint and entitlement, obligation and right, simultaneously to asymmetric effects. I have a quote, a nice quote from Karl Marx in this context. He says, "Is not money the bond of all bonds? Can it not dissolve and bind all ties?" There's no better example of this, it seems to me, than one of the financial instruments that lay at the heart of the financial crisis of 2008, the collateralized debt obligation, the CDO. Here, as I'm sure you're all too familiar, mortgage debts were commodified, bundled together, and hyperbolically traded along with the insurance contracts designed to shore them up. So far removed from the original creditor-debtor relationship, which inaugurated them, that no one knew or cared about how many removes they were, so long as they were making money for someone. But the dual capacity to both bind and loose played out emphatically when the house of cards came toppling down. Those with the mortgages and the inability to pay still retained the obligation to repay, this initial primary obligation. Whilst the traders who made the massive gains got away with the money and remained obligation-free. We might note in passing then that the unbound person today, which haunts legal and social thought and society, is no longer, in one sense, the outsider, but rather the insider. The one who makes their fortune but escapes obligations, primarily of tax, because they're sent offshore to the Cayman Islands or wherever, whilst at the same time relying on the complexities of the law of obligations, trusts, offshore tax havens, and the like. Roger's article from 1987, I think, on trusts gave some early insight into how the moralized language of trust could be used for these utterly immoral purposes. So it's perhaps the ghostly presence of these shady figures, the real free riders of modern society, whose presence haunts the rest of us, who do pay our taxes. The point here is that legal obligations, both through legal personality and commodification, in these first two senses, play remarkably creative and limiting functions in modern societies. Together, they form a part of the dominant modalities of law's co-optation in capitalist social relations. And how they do so exemplifies and fosters the asymmetries of power, wealth, and inequality that are their primary feature. The third characteristic of legal obligations is one that is common to the first two and contributes to them by making legal obligations different from other kinds of social obligations. That is, legal obligations are enforceable in specific ways. Commonly, this means that they are guaranteed by a third party, usually, but not necessarily the state. Combined with law's social priority and the legal institution's ability to direct coercion in an organized manner, the enforceability of legal obligations secures them a presence which other obligations, moral, civic, familial, etc., lack. In terms of the ecology of obligations, this means that legal obligations rely on social structures, such as those that generate wealth or deploy force, whilst at the same time having a major capability for directing these flows of wealth and or the licensing of coercion. In other words, the force of law can be brought to bear decisively on the broader distribution of obligations, sometimes supporting, sometimes denying them. As well, it can police the operation of obligation obedience hybrids as and when required. Right, with these senses of law's specific contribution to the ecology of obligations, let me turn to this notion of the hybrid then that I just mentioned to see what light it might shed on our subject. To think about this, let me start by introducing a wonderful formulation of Rousseau's from the Social Contract. He writes, "The strongest are never strong enough always to be master, unless they transform strength into right and obedience into obligation." This transformation was for Rousseau achieved through the social contract itself. It offered a metamorphosis from empirical strength to normative right, from practices of obedience to that of obligation. Yet the metamorphosis was not total. They seldom are. The latter of the two pairings, right and obligation, still relied on the capacities or conformities exhibited by strength or coercion and obedience or conformity. To this image then, this metamorphosis, we might add one more insight before coming back to the hybrid from another social contract theorist, this time Hobbes. In the Leviathan, Hobbes notes that the bond of law, I'm paraphrasing here, may be made to hold not by the difficulty but by the danger of breaking it. Bond of law may be made to hold not by the difficulty but the danger of breaking it. In other words, law as a normative order provides for the freedom of people to obey the law. But at exactly the same time, it guarantees the freedom to break the law. And ever the realist, of course, Hobbes says that breaking the law is not difficult. Breaking the law is easy. It's rather, and for Hobbes it certainly should be, dangerous to break the law, even if it's not difficult. The liability to sanction or punishment follows from the breach and makes law breaking dangerous. The key point for me about hybrids of obligation and obedience is that they contain both elements that I've been talking about, freedom and obligation under a norm, and the unfreedom and conformity essential to practices of obedience. And these practices of obedience include not just obedience in relation to law, that's the least of it. The real work is to be found in the practices of obedience within the ecology of obligations, and for my purposes at the moment, the importance of the market, of the laws of the market, of conformity and practices of obedience within market structures. The legal norm operates, in a sense, as a gateway through which these other forms of obedience are set to work. But like a gateway drug, one thing leads to another, much worse thing. Yet the point about the hybrid is that these worse things are reliant on the legal form to induce entry. And once entered, these things are, unlike legal norms, very difficult to break. Like an addictive drug habit, they go far beyond the control or freedom of the agent. In terms of law then, what may appear, or in fact be, an initial consent, signing up to a wage contract, a rent agreement, or a mortgage, quickly puts them, the signer, into the arena of non-consensual conformities. These will include various things, these non-consensual conformities. In the examples of wage or rent or mortgage, interest rates, market fluctuations, With respect to work contracts, it may be, in the universities, exposure to the conformities of the REF, or league tables, or citation indexes, and the kinds of things that we are all too familiar with. These are no longer choices made by individuals agreeing to the wage contract, but rather the whole panoply of obedience practices are set to work in guiding behavior in ways that are very difficult to break with. Legal obligations are necessary to inaugurate these, and they remain, these legal obligations, in one sense, very easy to break. But this fact neither explains the full extent of the operation of the law, nor the necessities or constraints that maintain the field of operation. What is essential to this hybrid form, then, is not that there are two realms, as Foucault famously put it, one realm of the juridical and one of the disciplinary, the former attaching or addressing or dealing with or tuned to rights, the latter to the conformities of disciplinary power. Rather, it is because, as we've seen, role responsibilities are central to the legal form, role responsibilities as they are formulated through legal personality, that their constitutive function in law, which is itself, in fact, not amenable to negotiation, wage value, labor value, and so on, that is embodied in this legal form. These constitutive aspects of law are essential to the ways in which practices of obedience operate. These hybrids, then, are central to law's operation, even if they tend to be disassociated in much legal analysis. So it's one thing, then, to ask, do we have an obligation to follow the law? What the operation of hybrids and obligation obedience throw up are far harder types of question to address. Ought we to obey market forces? How do we break the laws of the market? That such questions register as difficult, maybe even awkward, within our current legal frameworks, suggests that the specific types of hybrid of legal obligation and obedience are so tightly woven into our social and mental fabrics that becoming unbound from them is such a daunting task. Yet it's these hybrids and this ecology that would provide a starting point for an analysis that shifted attention away primarily from rights and onto obligations and the hybrids of obligations and obedience. Well, if that seems a bit grim, I'd like to take Max up on his kind description that, well, it needn't all be, right? So let me end on a slightly more positive note. It's attention, descriptive attention, to the operation of these hybrids that seems to me to be a primary starting point for what might be called obligations critique. We know we've had plenty of rights critique, but an obligations critique may allow us to see and prioritize things differently. It would be perhaps more relevant or more adequate to thinking about the conditions and consequences of our current situation as we hurtle through ever-increasing inequalities towards global catastrophe. Obligations limit and constrain in the ways that I've tried to describe. But, here's the positive part, they also can contribute to an understanding of what Roger called in the final chapter of his recent book, juristic forms of solidarity. It seems to me that obligations are central to relationships of solidarity in ways that rights are not. Solidarity consists in bonds of trust, reciprocity, and respect for dignity. And relations of solidarity cannot be built on foundations of exploitation. Instead, solidarity's primary locus is the collective, and its telos is the common good. So its obligation's intimate connection with developing and sustaining collective identities over time that provides a potential resource for ties of solidarity to flourish. There is then, as we've seen, a dual potential of obligations, at once constraining in ways that limit and produce inequalities, and ways that may possibly restore solidarity. Seen through the lens of obligation, the constitutive relations amongst law, politics, and the economy can be held up to the demands of and for solidarity that may deploy alternative ways of analysing and critiquing the limits and potential of collective action today. Thank you very much.